Hi guys. Today what we're going to be focusing on, we are going to be focusing on coming up with a systematic way of solving our problem. Now all of you guys have heard about our problem, which is to take an egg, design a device that will be able to protect our egg when we drop it from various distances. And so our focus today is how are we going to be able to do that in a systematic way. So oftentimes when we hear the word design, we think of the general word about making something. In this case, what we're going to be talking about is actually a systematic process of solving a problem. And so when we think about the design process, like I said, it's talking about a systematic way of understanding what the problem is, coming up with the criteria for the problem, and then brainstorming solutions to the problem, narrowing it down to one that we're going to try to tackle and test, and then analyzing the results of that test, of that design. And so really it's a systematic process that one can follow and helps us kind of stay organized and helps us kind of be able to communicate with others on what we've been doing. And you'll notice that in this design process, there's 6 steps that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to go a little bit more in depth with each one of those steps. So the first step that we're going to be talking about is identifying a problem. And in this case, oftentimes, when we have a problem that's presented to us, we have to think about, is this a problem we really should be focusing on? Is this a problem that needs our attention? If you figure out, yes, it is something that needs our attention, then we go ahead and ask ourselves, is it something that already has solutions that are just fine, that work effectively? And when we look at that situation, if there are designs that are effective, then oftentimes we have to say, maybe we should go ahead and spend our time solving a problem that's we can go ahead and work on. Now, if we go ahead and decide that, yes, this is the problem we want to go ahead and tackle, we then go ahead and actually create what's called a design brief, and you can see that on your screen. Now, the design brief is just a way of helping clarify what we need to do. So it kind of zooms us in on identifying who our client really is, being able to narrow down onto what is the actual problem we're trying to solve, and then coming up with what are we going to do to be able to actually solve the problem. Then lastly in this whole process, it allows us to kind of identify the constraints, things that we have to think about when designing our solution. And then lastly, kind of talk as a group, because usually this is done in a team of engineers, team of people. We have to think about how are we going to present this information to others. And so that's the process of the design brief. It kind of helps us clarify, narrow down to what our problem is and what we're going to do to try to tackle this problem. All right, after we've decided on our problem, that we understand that it's acceptable, it's justified, we go ahead and start coming up with our research to come up with solutions or ideas that will help us solve the problem. And so we are going to be doing some research to find out what solutions are already present and kind of be able to see if they're effective, brainstorm all the different kinds of solutions, and then in a systematic way use a tool called a decision matrix. And that tool will help us be able to evaluate our ideas to kind of narrow it down into one idea, because that's our goal, is to come up with one idea that we're going to then build and test. And so what we do is we typically come up with a criteria and judge each solution or idea that we have based on that criteria. So we might have one that's really, really complex, but not very cost effective. Maybe we have one that's really good at going ahead and solving all the problems, but it's going to be too costly. So it's a way of being able to narrow it down into coming up to one solution and in a systematic way. Once we have narrowed it down to one solution, we always have to go back to, do we have the technology or materials to be able to go out and accomplish this solution? And if not, we might have to go back and come up with other possible ideas that might work, or redefining our problem. Now, let's say, for example, we've come up with a solution. We have the materials to be able to go ahead and start developing that idea a little further. We go through a process of coming up with a very detailed sketch or drawing of what we're wanting our solution to look like or idea to look like. And so that's when we go ahead and include technical drawings. Now, these technical drawings must include materials that we want to use to help develop this idea, what size of it's going to be, what shape, and we need to make sure that we have even possibly the assembly determined of how to go ahead and build it, the steps that it's going to take to go ahead and create this idea. Once we have all of that written down and decided upon, we still have to go back through and say, is it possible? Can we possibly do it? If we can't possibly do it, then we have to go back to the drawing board and come up with other possible solutions. Now, let's say, for example, it is something that's possible. We've worked out all the details. Then we actually go ahead and start building it. And so notice there's lots of steps that we had to take before we actually get to the construction process. But once we actually get to the construction process, we actually build it out of the materials we said we were going to go ahead and build it, follow the prototype, follow the technical drawings, and then we even have to start coming up with how are we going to test it? What are the plans that we're going to go ahead and need to take to be able to go ahead and see if this is an actual effective design? So oftentimes when we think about planning our test, we have to think about its performance. Is it going to perform the way it needs to? Is the design actually durable? Is it going to withstand over time? Is it actually usable? And so when we're coming up with our testing of our prototype, we have to kind of come up with an experiment that will be able to test all of those things, because we want it to be effective and we want it to solve the problem. And so while we're developing those tests and writing down our very specific procedure for that test, we have to kind of keep in mind what we want that problem, what we want the design to solve. And once we come up with our experiment, then we actually go ahead and test our prototype. So we put it to the test, we find out if it's effective or not, and how we do that is we have to collect data. Now we want to collect qualitative data by our observations, maybe describing what happens, but we also want to make sure we're coming up with quantitative data. Now, after we go ahead and collect the data, we want to take a look at the data and see if it's reliable. If the data is not reliable, we may have to go back to the drawing board. We may have to go back to generating a new possible idea to test, or maybe even redefining the problem. Now, let's say we found out that our data is reliable, we evaluated everything, we think that it's a great solution. That's when we can go on to the next step. So you notice we're moving on to the fifth step, which is evaluating our solution. Now, when we look at the data, we're really wanting to make sure that we're testing to see, is it accomplishing everything that the problem is set out to do? So we're looking back at the criteria, looking back at the constraints, and seeing if the data really matches. We also have to reflect on, do we need to make some improvements? And if so, what improvements do we need to make to our design? And then lastly, again, going back to, does it solve the problem? If not, then we have to go again back to the drawing board and go back a few steps. Maybe come up with a new solution to try. Maybe going ahead and redefining the problem. You'll soon notice that there's lots of many steps that we're going to constantly go ahead and cycle through and go back to. So we want to present this information to our clients. You can present it several different ways. Oftentimes it's presented either with documents, so a document portfolio, or it's presented through a formal presentation. And you guys will be able to choose based on the situation that we have. As you'll notice that these steps, the 6 steps, it may look like through this graphic organizer that it's very linear, but in fact, you'll notice that some of these steps, they kind of backtrack, and it's not the same path every single time we go through a different problem. That sometimes you're going to go back to step number 2 several times if something doesn't work. And that's perfectly fine, because again, it's a systematic process that if one of the steps doesn't work, you backtrack and you go to the last kind of avenue to go ahead and see if you can come up with a systematic way of solving it. This is the process that we're going to be using. If you happen to have any questions, please make sure you feel free to ask me. Make sure you have these in your notes, because we're going to be referring to them often, and we'll see you tomorrow.